Hello and welcome to Inside Israel. I'm Mariam Azashur. Today's program contains alarming information that is growing reports concerning child abuse. It has been discovered that American pedophiles of Jewish background have found a safe haven in, you guessed it, Israel. A new report by the US-based Jewish Community Watch states that many of these pedophiles flee to Israel to distance themselves from the hands of justice. The following report contains more information on the topic, which I must warn you in advance is disturbing.
A new report by the US-based Jewish Community Watch says that many accused Jewish pedophiles in US flee to Israel to escape justice. The report adds that many of the accused go on to abuse children in Israel as well. Jewish Community Watch is a US-based organization that tracks accused pedophiles. It started tracking accused pedophiles in 2014. Since then, it has identified more than 60 Jews who have fled from the US to Israel. According to CBS News outlet that also investigated the issue, the actual number is likely much larger. Jewish Community Watch said that it happens across the wider Jewish community, including in the modern Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox communities. So how has this been allowed to happen in the first place? The blame starts with the Israeli regime for allowing men and women accused of pedophilia. Israeli law enforcement has come up short in prioritizing the search for suspects. Jewish men and women have been able to escape to Israel using the law of return, which grants any person with a Jewish grandparent the right to obtain Israeli citizenship automatically. Pedophiles use this law as an escape route to Israel. Help from the community is a reoccurring theme in the report by JCW. Israeli law effectively allows Jewish pedophiles to flee court-mandated supervision in their home countries and move to Israel with a clean slate. Of course, any criminal can flee to another country, but it's only in Israel that pedophiles get the visa to remain there. Because Israel welcomes all Jews, they're protected in Israel. After they receive their visa, they automatically receive citizenship in a very short period of time and also receive help from regime organizations, including financial assistance, to move to Israel.
The criminals who flee to Israel generally fall within one of two categories. They're either formally convicted pedophiles who flee to Israel to evade justice, or have been suspected of the crime but not yet formally charged. Therefore, they flee to Israel from the States prior to their trial and before a guilty verdict is handed down. But how are they making their way into Israel? And which institutions are allowing this to happen? Watch the following case study to find out more on the topic.
First of all, I think that we are talking here about a Jewish pedophile from different citizenships all over the world that are using the fact that as Jews that they are welcome anytime in Israel. They come here and they hide in different places in small communities, and they try to avoid being on trial in their own countries. The fact that there is the law of return for the Jews all over the world, that they can be used anytime without a lot of questioning why you are coming to Israel and why you are seeking as if a refugee in Israel. This is the main opportunity that is existing for them, and they are using it. In Israel, the issue of pedophiles is a very, let's say, risky issue, because till today, for example, pedophiles are not enforced to inform in any community that they have been accused or have been judged for being pedophiles. So the communities do not know anything about the past of the pedophiles when they come and live inside them. That's what makes the issue is even more dangerous for the children in the community, for the whole security of the community in general. Usually when any Jewish arrive to Israel, it arrived by the law of the return, which gives any Jewish person all over the world the possibility to get full citizenship the minute they arrive to Israel. They are welcomed. They are also supported by the government in order to find jobs and places to live. So for them, this is a very good opportunity to hide from any, from their past as convicted or accused, and to be integrated inside a new community without knowing anything about the crimes they have committed. In my opinion, it depends very much on the Jewish person who got integrated here, how much contacts he have inside his community, or if under the claim of protecting any Jew from persecution in the world. Of course, I don't agree on that approach, but in the Israeli current right-wing government, they believe that they have to protect any Jew from persecution all over the world. That's why they do not investigate them. They do not try really to hand them back to the countries where they are accused. There's a very famous case of this head of a school who used to be abusing the girls or the pupils in her school in Australia, and she flew to Israel, and she got a chance to live in a very closed community and to get in touch with high-profile people in Israel. When the Australian authorities wanted the Israeli authorities to deliver her back in order to get her on trial, actually she got support not least from the Minister of Health in Israel, who is belonging to the same ultra-Orthodox Jewish community that she belongs to.
We have with us Shana Aronson from the Israeli branch of the Jewish Community Watch. Welcome to the show, Ms. Aronson. Now, why do you think that these pedophiles are being allowed to enter Israel?
Well, so that's an important question, because the phenomenon of pedophiles or any kind of abusers or criminals for that matter moving from one country to the next or from one state to the next is not actually unique to Israel. This is a very, very widespread problem that happens all over the world. People that are criminals, if they don't want to get caught, they will move around so they can continue to have access to victims. What's different about Israel is that Israel is the one country, that I'm aware of at least, where there's a concept of a law of return, where someone can actually get citizenship on the basis of their religion. So that, just makes it easier in the case of Israel for individuals who are Jewish to be able to move to Israel and get access to citizenship.
So it's been stated in the reports that these pedophiles continue committing crimes once inside Israel. Can you please elaborate on that?
I think they get away with that for the same reason that pedophiles really in across the world are getting away with their crimes so often and so regularly. The statistics really worldwide in Western countries that gather these kinds of statistics about how many pedophiles actually will serve time in prison are really abysmal and horrifying. Pedophiles are, just as criminals go, they're incredibly manipulative, and children often don't speak up. So, once somebody moves here, they're somebody moves to Israel, they're starting fresh, so to speak. They don't have the background, this negative background following them. So they have this new clean slate, and they're going to go on continue to abuse if that's what they want to do. And they will, and it will be likely that they will either not get caught, or it will take a very long time for them to get caught, as is so often the case.
What measures, if any, is the Tel Aviv regime taking to prevent the influx of pedophiles into Israel?
I mean, that was something that I had said that is absolutely, I believe, to be the case. There are certainly some checks in place. There are very basic background checks that are performed, but for many people, it's as simple as, a signed kind of affidavit, which is so easy to obtain. And for someone who is already a criminal, they're not going to have any hesitation to lie on that kind of, document. So the problem is that, yes, it's not thorough enough, and I do believe that there need to be resources dedicated to this.
Well, we also have in the reports that Israel refuses to extradite criminals upon request. Now, why is that the case?
So officially, Israel will extradite any pedophiles, assuming there's an extradition request from another country with which Israel has an extradition treaty, which there are numerous countries where there is an extradition treaty in place. However, what we find practically happens is that another aspect of the law of return is the idea that there is a certain protection afforded to certainly to Israeli citizens once they're there. So for somebody, I don't think, I'm sure that holds true in some other countries as well, but there seems to be a particular, something sort of the particular that goes on that's inherent in the Israeli system, that really there's just a tremendous amount of protections afforded to the citizens, and therefore once they're in the country and someone else is requesting extradition, the process and the lengths that will have to just go on by the prosecutor's office to actually get that person extradited is just incredibly difficult and lengthy.
Well, Ms. Aronson, thank you for joining us. Shayna Aronson from Jewish Community Watch in Israel. Inactive authorities, that's the group of people who enable pedophiles to find a safe haven in Israel. We have a lot more to cover on this topic right here after a short break. We were curious to see what the average Israeli thinks about all this. So we asked Israelis if they were aware that pedophiles are likely roaming around freely in their neighborhoods. Here's what they told us.
זאת שיודעת ומרשה לפושעים ולאנשים שעברו על החוק ופגעו אפילו באנשים, במיוחד בילדים, ולא נוקטת ביד קשה ברמת החוק וברמת להעניש וברמת לטפל אפילו באנשים האלה, זה דבר שהוא מאוד מסוכן ומסכן עדיין את החיים של כולנו ובמיוחד את הילדים. כי יש לזה עניין הפגיעה המינית או בעצם הטרדה או בעצם נושא האונס, זה פשוט יש לו השלכות נפשיות והשלכות.
אני רואה בחוק הזה, חוק השבות, כסמל לאפליה ולאי צדק לאומי, אבל גם מבחינה חברתית החוק הזה הוא מקור לדאגה. הקלות הבלתי נסבלת שבה אנסים ופדופילים מהקהילה היהודית, מארצות הברית במיוחד, מאוסטרליה ומקומות אחרים בעולם, נכנסים לארץ בחסות החוק הזה ונמלטים מהעמידה לדין, מתחמקים מהעמידה לדין בארצותיהם, הוא דבר שצריך להדאיג את כולנו. מדובר לפי רשת ה-CBS בלמעלה מ-60 פדופילים ואנסים אמריקאים שמתחבאים פה בינינו, מה שמסכן את ביטחוננו וביטחון הילדים והילדות שלנו. אלה אנשים שמסתובבים בינינו בחופשיות בתוך היישובים שלנו.
אני סבור כי ניתן לעשות שינוי בחקיקה, לעדכן את חוק השבות באופן שיאסור על כניסתם וחזרתם של כל מי שחשודים, כל מי שהורשעו בעבירות פדופיליה, להיכנס לתחום מדינת ישראל, לא רק פדופילים אלא גם כל מיני עברייני מין, לאסור כניסתם לישראל כי הדבר מסוכן. פדופיל ועבריין מין עלול להיות פצצה מתקתקת שעלול לגרום נזק לילדים, לכל האזרחים, ולכן יש לשנות את החקיקה באופן מובהק למנוע מהם כניסה לישראל. זה העניין. עניין נוסף, אני סבור שכל מיני עברייני מין שמנסים למצוא מקלט במדינת ישראל על ידי מחו"ל, מארצות הברית, למצוא בישראל מקלט.
חוק השבות לא נועד על מנת לתת לגיטימציה לאדם, לעבריין לחמוק מאימת הדין. חוק השבות נועד להעניק לאזרח יהודי לחזור לארץ, ולא לעבריינים אשר מבצעים עבירות בחוץ לארץ. לכן כל מי שמבצע עבירה בחוץ לארץ ובכוונתו לחזור לארץ על מדינת ישראל.
רבות בחדשות על כל מיני דוחות שמתייחסים לכל העניין של חשודים שנמצאים בארצות הברית ובמקומות אחרים, כאילו יהודים החשודים בהטרדות מיניות שמנסים לברוח לארץ או לבוא ולהגיע לארץ ולשפט לפי דיני מדינת ישראל. אני חושב שממשלת ישראל לא עושה מספיק בעניין הזה על מנת למנוע הגעתם של אותם חשודים בהטרדות מיניות נגד ילדים לארץ, וצריך לזכור שמי שכן ביצע פעולות מגונות או הטרדות מיניות בילדים בארצות הברית הוא גם עלול לחזור לאותן עבירות גם בארץ אם הוא לא יועמד לדין באופן שמשאיר אותו בתוך הכלא. אכן שמעתי על דוח כזה של ארגון בארצות הברית שמדבר בעצם על זה שיהודים החשודים בהטרדות מיניות בילדים
Activists say that there's a hole in the law allowing convicted sex offenders to roam freely in Israel. It's a fact that Israel's prison services are unable to monitor these pedophiles. But that's not the only hurdle in the path of Israel's legal system addressing the problem with pedophiles. Here's more on the topic.
Predators use their ideological and religious connections within their respective Jewish communities inside Israel to find a route to Israel undetected. Also, because perpetrators can't be held accountable unless victims come forward, many cases are believed to go unreported. These men and women are technically escaping charges that include rape, sodomy, indecent assault, sexual harassment, making threats, and the possession and production of child pornography. Even if the authorities in their home countries do move to press charges after arriving in Israel, Tel Aviv is reluctant to extradite citizens, meaning the perpetrator can continue to live in Israel and move about freely. Israeli courts are unlikely to hear a case if the crime happened elsewhere outside of Israel. Israel's prison services is unable to monitor pedophiles. Activists say that this is a hole in the law that allows convicted sex offenders to roam freely in Israel. According to CBS, Israeli law enforcement does not adequately address abuse and is unable to supervise repeat offenders. There is no sex offender registry in Israel, and even if culprits get sued, they can hire a lawyer just to silence parents and those who warn parents about a suspected child offender. Jimmy Joseph Caro, convicted in the United States on 3 counts of child abuse and violated his terms of parole in order to flee to Israel under a false identity. In Israel, he is living a carefree, happy life. Mordechai Yomtov pleaded guilty to abusing and committing lewd acts against 3 boys, is living freely in Israel. Yonah Weinberg, a convicted pedophile from New York living in Israel. The list goes on and on with no end in sight.
Writer and political activist Gilad Atzmon joins us from Athens on this topic. Welcome to the show, Mr. Atzmon. Now, besides child abuse, what other crimes are these individuals taking refuge for in Israel?
This is a good question, but I tend to believe that for Israel to start to look into its Jewish immigration would interfere sharply with its finance, because Israel is a tax haven for a lot of dirty money from France, from Britain, from America. There was now a very big case that was settled, I think, between Bank Leumi and the American tax authorities. If Israel will start to look into the criminal background of those who are entitled to its citizenship, its finance may be damaged.
Well, what about Israelis? Do they trust their authorities?
I don't think that anyone out there is too impressed with the Israeli justice system or with the general ethics in the Jewish state, a state that can run the biggest open-air prison known to man, a state that can deploy its soldiers to shoot young Palestinians in the knees, is not a state that presents any high ethical standard. Quite the opposite. So, being a home for many Jewish pedophiles and tax evaders and other type of low beings and criminals is far from being a great surprise to all of us.
Thank you for that, Mr. Atzman. That was Gilad Atzman, writer and political activist from Athens. And now's the time to look at some news stories from Israel. The Jerusalem Post. Israel refuses to test people with corona symptoms unless they've recently traveled abroad or to the occupied Palestine territories, even when they're exhibiting serious symptoms. Vinet News. Israeli doctors demand that Health Minister Yaakov Litzman be replaced with a professional. In an open letter, doctors lament years of neglect that's left Israel's healthcare system at its lowest point during the time of coronavirus outbreak. Sources say there are no plans to replace Litzman in the next cabinet. Globes. Big-time Israeli investor Avi Tyomkin warns that Israeli leaders show no grasp of the scale of the crisis or of what needs to be done. According to him, it is frightening to see the Prime Minister, heads of the Ministry of Finance, and the Governor of the Bank of Israel and his staff almost completely paralyzed with no understanding of the scope of the current crisis and the abyss that lies before Tel Aviv. The Times of Israel. For the first time ever, more than 1 million Israelis are unemployed. Israel's National Employment Services says the rate stands at 24.1%, capping the worst month for Israel's workforce since data has been recorded. Haaretz. Netanyahu behind closed doors. Deep state controls Israel. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has delivered lengthy speeches in recent months on how the current Israeli political system is not run by elected politicians, but rather by a secretive cabal he calls the deep state. And that's what we've discovered in this week's investigation. But what can you add on the topic? We're looking forward to receiving your comments and questions at presstv.com. Until next time.